Hello students, I am Raghavan Kumar Singh, faculty of US Academy and Institute. Today we will discuss class 9th history's 5th chapter, Pastoralists in the Modern World. In this chapter we will discuss about nomadic pastoralists. Nomads are peoples who do not live in one place but move from one area to another to earn their livings, and how pastoralism has been influenced in societies like India and Africa, the way colonialism impacted their lives, and how they have coped with the pressure of modern society. Pastoralism has been important in societies like India and Africa for years. Pastoralism is a way of keeping animals such as cattle, sheep, that involves moving from one place to another to find water and food. Nomads are peoples who do not live in one place but move from one area to another to earn their livings. Now, pastoral nomads and their movements. In the mountain, mainly pastoral communities are found in mountain regions like Gujjar Bakarwal. Gujjar Bakarwal of Jammu and Kashmir are great herders of goat and sheep. Many of them migrated here in the 19th century in search of pastures for their cattle and settled here. In winter, when the mountains were covered with snow, they lived with their herds in the low hill of Shivalik ranges. Here, the dry scrub forest provided pastures for their herds. They crossed the Pir Panjal passes and entered Kashmir Valley. In summer season, when the snow melted in the mountain and mountain sides were left lush green, they moved into high levels. The variety of sprouted grass provided rich nutrition forage for their animals. By the end of September, they used to start moving again from their downward journey back to their winter base. Several households were together for this journey, forming in kafila. Now, mandaps of Ringal. The Gurjar cattle herders live in the mandaps made of ringal, hill bamboo, and grass from the bagyal. A mandap was also a workplace. Here, the Gujars used to make ghee, which they took down for sale. In recent years, they have begun to transport the milk directly in buses and trucks. These mandaps are at about 10,000 to 1100 feet, as buffaloes cannot climb any higher. Gaddi Safard is a pastoral community of Himachal Pradesh. They have a similar cycle of seasonal movement, like Gujjar Bakarwals of Jammu and Kashmir. During winter, Gaddi Safard graze their flocks in scrub forest of the low hills of Shivalik ranges. By April, they moved north and spent the summer in Lahul and Spiti. Further to the east, in Garhwal and Kumaon, the Gujjar cattle herders came down to the dry forest of the Bhabar in the winter and went up to the high meadow, the Bagyal, in summer. Many of the Gujjar cattle herders were originally from Jammu and Kashmir and came to the uphills in the 19th century in search of good pasture. When the snow melted on the high mountain, they moved into higher mountains meadow, dhars. By September, they began their return movement. On the way, they stopped against in the village of Lahul and Spiti, reaping their summer harvest and sowing their winter crop. Bhutias, Sherpas, and Kanorias, many pastoralists of the Himalayas, like the Bhotias, Sherpas, and Kanorias, also followed cyclic movement between summer and winter in search of pasture. They all have to adjust to seasonal changes and make proper use of available pasture. When the pasture was exhausted or unusable in one place, they moved their herds and flocks to new areas. This continuous movement of the pastoralist allowed the pasture to recover. On the plateau, plains, and desert. The pastoral communities are also found in the plateau, plains, and desert of India. Dhangar were an important pastoral community of Maharashtra. In the early 20th century, their population was more than 4 lakh. They were mainly shepherd, blanket weavers, and buffalo herders. Dhangars stayed in the central plateau of Maharashtra. During the monsoon, this tract becomes a vast grazing ground for their flocks. By October, the Dhangar harvested the bajra and started to move towards west. After a month, reached Konkan, which had high rainfall and rich soil. Here, they were welcomed by the Konkani peasants. After the harvest of the Kharif crop, the fields had to be fertilized and made ready for the Rabi harvest. Dhangar flocks manured the field and fed on the stubble. The Konkani peasants also gave supplies of rice, which the shepherds took back to the plateau where grains were scarce. With the onset of monsoon, they returned to their settlements on the dry plateaus as sheep could not tolerate the wet monsoon condition. The Golas, Kurumas, and Kurubas. The Golas, Kurumas, and Kurubas are the important pastoral communities of the dry central plateau of Karnataka and Andhra Pradesh. The Golas herders cattle, the Kumaras and Kurubas reared sheep and goats and sold woven blankets. They lived near the forest, cultivated small patches of lands. Engaged in a variety of small trade and took care of their herds. The movement of these pastoralists depend on monsoon and dry seasons. In the dry season, they moved to the coastal tracts and left when the rain comes. Only buffaloes liked the swampy, wet condition of the coastal areas during the monsoon month. Other herds had to be shifted to the dry plateau at that time. The life of pastoral groups is not easy. It was sustained by careful consideration of a host of factors. They had to judge how long the herds could stay in one area and know where they could find water and pasture. They needed to calculate the timing of their movement and ensure that they could move through different territories. Customary rites that are used by peoples by custom and tradition. They had to set up a relationship with farmers on the way so that the herders could graze in harvest field and manure the soil. They combined a range of different activities like cultivation, trade, and herding to make their living. Colonial rule and pastoral life. The colonial government made different laws from time to time, which severely affected the lives of the pastoralists. Their grazing grounds shrank. Their movements were regulated. They had to pay high revenue. Their agricultural stock declined and their trades and craft were also affected adversely. The colonial power believed that all grazing lands were wastelands because they were productive. These lands did not produce revenue or agricultural products. From the mid 19th century, wastelands rules were enacted in various parts of our country. The government granted selected individuals various concessions and encourages to settle them in these areas. Even some of them were made as headmen of the village. In most areas, the land taken over were actually grazing tracts used regularly by pastoralists as their customary rights. They believed that grazing destroyed the sapling and young shoots of trees that germinated on the forest floor. The herds crushed the sapling and munched away. These prevented new trees to grow. The Forest Act made by the British government changed the lives of pastoralists. Some forests which produced commercially valuable timbers like Devdar or Saul were declared as reserved. In the reserved forest, no pastoral activity was allowed, and in the protected forest, their activities were strictly restricted. In the protected forest, they needed a permit for entry. The permit specified the timing of their entry and departure. If they overstayed there, they were liable for fines. British officials were very suspicious of nomadic peoples. They wanted to rule over a settled population which could be easily identified and controlled. In 1871, the British government in India passed the Criminal Tribes Act. By this act, many communities of craftsmen, traders, and pastoralists were classified as criminal tribes. They were stated to be criminal by nature and birth. As a result of this act, these communities were expected to live only in notified village settlements, and they were not allowed to move without a permit. The village police also kept a strict watch on them. In the mid 19th century, grazing tax was introduced by the British government in most pastoral lands of India. In order to increase income, the government imposed tax even on animals. The tax per head of cattle went up rapidly, and the system of the collection was made increasingly efficient. In the decades between the 1850s and 1880s, the right of collect the tax was carried out by contractors. These contractors tried to extract high tax so that they could earn the profit. By the 1880s, the government began collecting taxes directly from the pastoralists. Each of them were given a pass. The pastoralists had to pay tax on every animal they grazed in the pasture. To enter a grazing tract, the pastoralists had to show the pass and pay the tax. Effects of colonial changes on the lives of pastoralists. Waste rules, Forest Acts, Criminal Tribes Act, and imposing of grazing tax affected the lives of pastoralists badly. The affected were that these measures led to the serious shortage of pasture as grazing lands were turned into cultivated lands. The shepherds and cattle herds and no longer freely grazed their cattle in the forest. Nomadic peoples had to move frequently from one place to another in search of pasture. The animal stocks declines as underfed cattle died in a large number during scarcities and famine. Now the ways by which pastoralists cope with the changes. Pastoralists coped up with the changes in a variety of ways, such as some reduced the number of cattle in their herds since there was not enough pasture to feed large numbers. Some discovered new pastures when movement to old grazing grounds becomes difficult. Many poor pastoralists borrowed money from moneylender to survive. Some of them become laborers working on fields or in small towns. In spite of such difficulties, pastoralist communities still exist and are considered the most important form of life ecologically. Now, pastoralists in Africa. Africa is a country where over half the world pastoral's population lives. Even now, over 22 million Africans depend on some forms of pastoral activities for their livelihood. The different communities of Africa are Bedouins, Berbers, Maasai, Somali, Boran, and Turkana. Most of them lived in semi-arid grassland where rain-fed agriculture is difficult. They raise cattle, camels, goats, sheep, and donkey. They sell milk, meat, animal skin, and wool. Some of them earn through trade and transport. Others combine pastoral activities with agriculture, field, and still others do a variety of odd jobs. The Maasai are nomadic and pastoral peoples who depend on milk and meat for subsistence. The title Maasai derived from the word Ma. Mai, Sai means my people. Before colonial rule, Maasai land stretched over a vast area from North Kenya to the steppes of northern Tanzania. In the late 19th century, European imperial powers divided regions into different colonies. After colonial rule, best grazing lands of Maasai community were gradually taken over for white settlement, and the Maasai were pushed into a small area in southern Kenya and northern Tanzania. By changing conditions, the Maasai were forced to agriculture. They started growing crops such as maize, rice, potatoes, cabbage. Maasai believed that tilling the land for crops farming is a crime against nature. Once you cultivate the land, it is no longer suitable for grazing. Where have the grazing lands gone? Before colonial time, Maasai lands stretched over a vast area from North Kenya to the steppes of northern Tanzania. In 1885, it was cut into half with an international boundaries between British Kenya and German Tanganyika. After the cut, the best grazing lands were gradually taken over for white settlement, and Maasai were pushed into a small area in South Kenya and North Tanzania. From the late 19th century, the British colonial government in East Africa encouraged local peasants communities to expand cultivation. In pre-colonial time, the Maasai pastoralists had dominated their agricultural neighbors both economically and politically. The loss of the finest grazing lands and water resources created pressure on the small area of land that the Maasai were confined within. The borders are closed. In the 19th century, African pastoralists could move over vast areas in search of pasture, but from the late 19th century, the colonial government began imposing various restrictions on their mobility. White settlers and European colonists saw pastoralists as dangerous and savage. The new territorial boundaries and restrictions imposed in them suddenly changed the life of pastoralists, which adversely affected both their pastorals and trading activity. When pastures dry. Pastoralists lived were affected by drought everywhere. That is why traditionally pastoralists moved from place to place to survive bad times and avoid crisis. But from the colonial period, the Masai were bound down to a fixed area, confined within a reserve, and prohibited from moving in search of pasture as the area of grazing lands shrank. The adverse effects of the drought increased in intensity. Not all are equally affected. In Masai land, not all pastoralists were equally affected by the changes in the colonial period. In pre-colonial times, Masai society was divided into two social categories: elders and warriors. The elders formed the ruling group and met in periodic council to decide on the affairs of the community and settle disputes. The warriors consist of younger people mainly responsible for the protection of the tribe and defending the community and organized cattle raid. The British introduced a series of measures that had important implication to administer the affairs of the Masai. They appointed chiefs of different subgroups of Masai who were made responsible for the affairs of the tribe. Restrictions were also imposed on raiding and warfare. These chiefs managed to survive the devastation of war and drought. But the life history of the poor pastoralists were different. In times of war and famine, they lost nearly everything. They had to go looking for work in the town. Some used to work as charcoal burner and some did odd jobs to earn their livings. The social changes in Maasai society occurred at two levels. First, the traditional difference based on age between the elders and warriors was disturbed, though it did not break down entirely. Second, a new distinction between the wealthy and the poor pastoralists developed. Now, conclusion. Pastoralist communities in different parts of the world are affected in different ways by changes in the modern world. The patterns of movements was affected by new laws and new borders. Pastoralists find it difficult to move in search of pasture and grazing becomes difficult. During the time of drought, cattle die in large numbers. Yet pastoralists do adapt to new times. They change the paths of their annual movement, reduce their cattle number, press for rights to enter new areas, exert political pressure on the government for relief, subsidy and other forms of support, and demand a right in the management of forest and water resources.